After the victory at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, an emboldened American militia led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold launched a secret attack on Fort Ticonderoga just weeks later. How did this battle take place? Who were the Green Mountain Boys, and what were the leadership challenges they caused? What was the significance of the fort's capture in this second major battle of the American Revolution? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York in the early stages of the American Revolution. Joining me for this discussion is Army historian Dr. Susan Brynne Long. Welcome, Brynne.
Thanks.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to this discussion, but before we get into it, let's just talk a little bit about your background. So Dr. Susan Brynne Long is the 2024-2025 Charles Young Fellow at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Her current monograph project is on American prisoner administration in the Revolutionary War. She teaches at the University of Delaware on colonial and revolutionary America and American military history. So thanks, Brynne. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Lee. Great to be here.
Great. So we're doing this whole series on the U.S. Army and the Revolutionary War. So the previous episode, we talked a lot about the opening phases, Lexington and Concord. But just soon after that, we have this other battle taking place at something that probably most Americans have never heard of, Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. So talk to me about that first. Give us a little bit of the strategic setting here. Where is Fort Ticonderoga, and why was it selected as a target?
Yeah, so I am going to very much be building on the excellent foundation that you and my colleague Joe Seymour started in that first episode, right, talking about sort of the opening moves of the American Revolution. And Ticonderoga very much builds on where Joe left off, where we were in a place where, you know, the British had started to punish Massachusetts in the wake of things like the Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre, right? We tend to think about Massachusetts as this hotbed of revolutionary sentiment, and the British certainly thought the same. So after the Tea Party, we have a series of punitive acts that Joe talked about where the British are going to try to cut off Massachusetts from the rest of the colonies. And this really represents a strategic blunder on the part of the British, because the thought process is, if we can just sort of nip this in the bud in Massachusetts, it's not going to spread. But instead, we see that a lot of revolutionaries across the colonies will be incensed by these so-called intolerable acts or coercive acts. And as a result, different revolutionaries are going to start sending men and support to Boston, which is considered to be sort of unfairly punished by the British, right? We get Lexington and Concord, and Joe narrated that very well. And in the wake of Lexington and Concord, the tenor of revolution is still very much at an all-time high pitch. And again, the British have miscalculated. This is not limited to Massachusetts. And I think that Ticonderoga is really emblematic of the fact that revolutionaries are not thinking about this in terms of an isolated event. They are thinking more broadly, right? So Lexington and Concord, these are defensive operations whereby the British, you know, Thomas Gage had sent British troops into the Massachusetts sort of backcountry to go and capture men, capture those rabble-rousers, and capture guns. Ticonderoga is different. Ticonderoga represents the first offensive operation of the revolutionaries. What's going on here is it's located in upstate New York at the confluence of these two major lakes, Lake George and Lake Champlain. The larger of the two is Lake Champlain. This is about a 125-mile-long lake, which connects basically Canada and the further south British North American colonies. So think about it as kind of a water route between Montreal and Albany, if you will, right? Lake Lake Champlain is a super important lake. There have been wars fought over this region for really hundreds of years, and we see this in the 7 Years' War, for example, as our most recent example. So Americans already have this conception of Lake Champlain as being a strategically important place when it comes to connecting British Canada and British North America further south, those colonies that will become the United States in time. So Ticonderoga, it's a bastion fort that's right on the confluence again of these two lakes. And previous to the British ownership of Ticonderoga, it had actually been constructed originally as a French fort. So it was constructed, 1755. It's called Fort Carillon, right? And that's the English pronunciation. I won't attempt to Carillon. It had played a significant role in the 7 Years' War. It served as a launching point for various French offensives. And in 1758, it actually was a very bloody battleground where a British general had tried to take a superior force of British troops in a frontal assault against the heavily entrenched French forces at Carillon. Again, outnumbered, but had tried, kind of incessantly to take this fort with a frontal assault. And as a result, it turns into one of the bloodier conflicts of early American history with over 2,000 British casualties, right?
And this fort, it's one of the star forts?
Yes. Yeah. So Carillon, as it's called at this point, this is a star-shaped fort. It's got 4 points and then 2 additional bastions with it. So
interlocking fire. I mean, it's a great concept for the establishment of a fort.
Right, because you can have cannon artillery at each of those bastions that will be able to provide good defense of that area. And so this is something that sort of the British learned the hard way in 1758, again, turns into a very, very bloody conflict and really adds to the specter of Ticonderoga as this impregnable fortress on the lake. Right, because 1758 goes by and the British were not successful in that frontal attack on Carillon. And as a result of this, it's going to be several more years before this fort actually falls to British possession. And that's not until 1759 when the British, under General Geoffrey Amherst, are going to take it and rename it Fort Ticonderoga as we know it now. So this Gibraltar of the North, this great bastion, very much seen as sort of the guardian of the Hudson-Champlain Passage, important strategically for connecting British Canada and those southern colonies, and also has this symbolic importance for Americans as an impregnable fortress. And that's sort of our setting.
Wow. And okay, so we know where it is and the importance, the strategic importance of that fort, really controlling. Is it the Hudson Valley that it's controlling?
Right there at the northern part of that. Right. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, how was the operation planned? And who are the key leaders here? Yeah.
So as I said, we're dealing with this sort of what's the word? We're dealing with a responsive moment in the weeks after Lexington Concord. The colonies are very much like, oh my gosh, okay, we've just been attacked, right? And so different revolutionaries across different colonies are going to begin thinking about Ticonderoga as a strategic fort that they should really grab the initiative of and just not sit around and wait for the British to attack again, but let's mount an offensive against the British.
So we didn't have a national army yet. The Continental Army hadn't been established yet.
Yeah.
So why did these leaders plan on that? Did somebody direct them to come up with this operation?
No, yeah, excellent question. So what we have are pretty much 2 leaders, and you mentioned them at the beginning, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, who are going to emerge as the leaders in the siege and the taking of Fort Ticonderoga and nearby Fort Crown Point, which we'll get to. But Ethan Allen, he is a frontier militiaman from Connecticut. And he is someone who's very much sympathetic to sort of the bubbling revolutionary cause. He has heard about Lexington and Concord. Everyone's heard about Lexington and Concord. But he's in a unique position in terms of his ability to contribute to the effort because he's the leader of a group of men called the Green Mountain Boys. The Green Mountain Boys are a group that formed in a territory known as the New Hampshire Grants in the 1770s. And the New Hampshire Grants were an area of land west of the Connecticut River between essentially New Hampshire and New York, right? What will become Vermont, what we know today as Vermont. And the Green Mountain Boys basically were a group of men under Ethan Allen's command that had gone into this territory that was heavily contested between New Hampshire and New York and tried to intimidate New York settlers out of settling there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so kind of a vigilante group, if for lack of a better
So
phrase.
they weren't formed because of the British, like they weren't formed as a militia or Minutemen.
No,
this is completely different reasons.
This is about land, baby. Okay. This is about we're gonna move, go get these New Hampshire grants, and this is about Ethan Allen seeking land. Now, of course, this is happening at the same. This is 1770s that the governor of New Hampshire is going to sell this land. That London becomes involved to a certain extent and basically says, hey, this land's actually New York's. Well, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys disagree, so they're kind of already engaged in militarized actions within this contested region while all this revolutionary stuff is going on, right? And so Ethan Allen, he is sympathetic to the revolutionary cause. He's going to get his Green Mountain Boys on board with basically beginning to plan an offensive against Ticonderoga, but they're not the only ones that have an idea in mind to go attack Ticonderoga. Massachusetts, right, this colony that's been so put upon by the British in the wake of these different punitive acts that Joe talked about in the previous episode, Massachusetts also wants to start rallying some militiamen to go and take Fort Ticonderoga again. They see it as strategically important if they can go and get this fort. Also prevent against, if the British are going to mount another offensive against the Americans, they might attempt to do so from Ticonderoga because it is right there at the base of British Canada, as I said. It's under the sphere of authority of General Guy Carleton, who's the royal governor of Canada at this point, of Quebec, right? And he's a very decorated general, and the fear is like, well, what if Carleton kind of mounts an attack against the Americans from Ticonderoga?
Oh, yeah.
And so Massachusetts is thinking about this as well. They're going to start gathering some militiamen. Connecticut will also begin, Connecticut revolutionaries under Silas Deane will also start gathering militiamen. So they all come together, and it's going to be Ethan Allen, as I said, and Benedict Arnold at the helm. Benedict Arnold, he's a little bit of an interesting story. He's actually also from Connecticut, and he is going to basically offer his services to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, which is a provisional wartime revolutionary authority which is established to replace the previous royal government of Massachusetts. And he says, look, we've already gotten confused and surprised by what happened at Lexington and Concord. Let's go mount an offensive against Ticonderoga. And he is going to ultimately join his efforts with Allen's efforts and the Green Mountain Boys, along with other militiamen from Connecticut and Massachusetts. And this will basically coalesce as the group that will mount an attack on Ticonderoga in May of 1775.
And at what point did Arnold and Ethan Allen get together and discuss this or develop a plan?
Yeah, so this is really interesting and very contested, actually. So Arnold, he offers his services, as I said, to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, and they give him a colonel's commission, and they say, okay, great, go into Massachusetts and go get militiamen under your command, and then go mount this expedition. So he's like, cool, I'm going to do this. He goes off and begins these efforts, and then he gets word Ethan Allen is already starting to gather troops around him. He's working with the Connecticut revolutionaries, and he's got these Green Mountain Boys, and they're going to go basically attack Ticonderoga before Arnold can get a piece of his pie. And he's like, oh no. So he, hightails it quick as he can to go catch up with Ethan Allen, who at this point is planning the expedition largely in Vermont. They're actually meeting at Castleton, Vermont.
Okay.
And this is where sort of the historic encounter between Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold will occur, is in Castleton, Vermont in early May as they're preparing for this expedition.
So let's talk about the preparation and the planning for the expedition. Not just the plan itself, but there are some leadership challenges that Benedict Arnold is facing because of the Green Mountain Boys. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So, Arnold is someone, in a lot of ways, he's very similar to Ethan Allen. They both had fought in the militia, in the Connecticut militia. They both had experience in the French and Indian War. But I would say Allen is definitely more of a leader of men than Arnold is at this stage. Allen had already, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, had experience sort of coalescing this group around him to go and intimidate New York settlers out of settling in the New Hampshire Grant. So these are men who had elected him as their colonel. They had chosen Allen to lead them. And Arnold, for his part, he's a merchant from Connecticut. He's had a bit of a tough upbringing and has always sort of risen to the top, as it were, but he has not had as much of that sort of on-the-ground frontier militarism that Allen had in his past. And beyond that, thinking about the specific moment we're dealing with, Arnold was told by the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, go get men and go attack Ticonderoga, right? He doesn't have time to do that before he gets word that Allen already has about 200 Green Mountain Boys under his command, right? And so he ends up leaving the few men he's already recruited and hurrying to Ticonderoga, or hurrying to Castleton, rather, in Vermont. He doesn't have anybody except for an aide with him.
Oh, wow.
So he can't show up with all these men and say, hey, I'd like to take command and look at these men I've brought with me. No, he's got like me, myself, and I in this Colonel's Commission from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. Okay, great. So he does attempt to take command of the Green Mountain Boys. He says he has the legal authority to do so. Allen contests this, but what's most important here is that the Green Mountain Boys will not submit themselves to Arnold's command. They say that they won't go on this mission if Arnold is going to lead it. And accounts differ. We see different situations where some people who were eyewitnesses say that even, swords were drawn, flintlocks were cocked, ready to go. Maybe it was a little bit more of a negotiation than that. We weren't there. We're not sure. But what ends up being the resolution is Allen says, I will command this attack, but you can be at the front of the group with me. You can be at the front of the troops with me. And I think that's telling, right?
Yeah.
I think it's telling because he could have slapped irons on Arnold. He could have arrested him.
Oh, wow.
Or some other way just said, no, you're not participating, but he doesn't. I think he sees something in Arnold. And I think he knows that this is somebody who's militarily capable and will be a help, right? At least not a hindrance to Ticonderoga and the events that are going to proceed.
Yeah, so let's talk about the plan then. They get together, they iron out the leadership. So what's the plan for attack? And I guess keeping in mind, the frontal assaults, right? The challenges of taking this fort. So with all that in mind, what was their plan of action?
Yeah, we don't want to repeat of Fort Carillon in 1758, right? And so Allen is strategic about this. He says, we're going to surprise them. We're going to go at dawn before anybody's awake. Now, they do outnumber the garrison. It's kind of a caretaker garrison at this point, which I think is also telling, by the way. The British clearly weren't planning some massive attack from Canada southwards, right? Because there's only a caretaker garrison at Ticonderoga and at Crown Point as well. There's not very many troops. There is about 50 total. Estimates vary in terms of like British troops that are actually in the garrison at the time. But nonetheless, Allen wants to play it safe. He's going to go ahead and surprise them instead of, trying to go for some more of a traditional engagement. So they will leave on May 9th from Castleton to relocate to Hand's Cove, which is a small cove basically on the Vermont side of Lake Champlain. We're going to get in boats, we're going to cross, and we're going to attack them before anybody's awake. So that's the plan, and this is what he decides to do, again, with Arnold at the front of the troops as well. He will actually split his force once they get to Hand's Cove. So he's only going to cross with about 83 of those men that I mentioned before. So again, about 200 Green Mountain Boys, and then roughly 60 Massachusetts and Connecticut militiamen who had joined on as well. So he's only going to cross with about 83 of those men. They're going to cross actually with boats that they had procured either from Skanesboro, which is another nearby town about 15 miles away on Lake Champlain, close to Lake Champlain, or from Crown Point. It's not really clear exactly where these flat-bottom vessels were taken from, but he gets two of them, and then they're able to cross that group of 83 men. Once they get there, they will be alert. The sentry is alerted to their presence, but is not able ultimately to mobilize the fort in time. And Allen will wake the garrison. He says in his memoir, which he wrote later, that they do this with 3 huzzahs, which I think is great. He has his men come in and say huzzah, 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 and it wakes everybody up. And that is when they will basically get the surrender of Fort Ticonderoga and the first successful offensive operation of the American Revolution.
Without a shot being fired? Without
a shot being fired, at least not by the Americans, right? Because there are conflicting reports that maybe the sentry had attempted to fire his flintlock. Differing reports, it could have misfired, it could have just missed Allen, but nonetheless, this is very much meant to sort of be a take them by surprise moment. They're not planning for any sort of traditional engagement. Wow.
Yeah, and you see that famous photograph of is it Allen or Arnold at the door?
Allen.
Yeah, and what happens in that moment?
So this is actually very interesting, and it's very contested as to exactly how, in what order did the people wake up and who woke up. But who he's talking to in that famous print is William de Laplace, who's the British commander at Ticonderoga. And again, it differs what he said. There are definitely some things he may have said I won't say on a podcast. Some firsthand witnesses said he said something akin to "come out of there, you old rat." He claimed himself to have said, "I am taking you captive by order of the Great Jehovah, or under the authority of the Great Jehovah and the Second Continental Congress." There's not, but this is years after the fact that he's writing. It sounds pretty flowery. We're not exactly sure what he said. Probably something that I won't say on the podcast.
No, that's fair. So they take the fort. How many prisoners were there? And I believe there's families there as well.
There are, and this really gets into my research as sort of the first prisoners of the American Revolution, right, are taken, yes, at Lexington and Concord, but also at Ticonderoga, Fort Crown Point. There's another engagement at Fort St. John that we might get into. But essentially, round about 100 total men, women, and children. That would be, Anglo and French Canadians who were actually soldiering these garrisons, but also their families, because garrisons are domestic spaces just as much as they are military spaces where you can have your family members with you. It's extremely hard to track, right, individual prisoner stories and what happens from the moment of being taken captive and being removed to a secondary, sometimes third and fourth locations, right, and removed throughout the war. What we know about this particular group that's taken in the summer engagements in northern New York and over at St. John as well is that most of them are going to be sent to Connecticut and to New York, right? And so these are just kind of convenient to where this engagement is happening. It's not very far to take the prisoners there. And once they get there, they will be placed under the authority of the revolutionary governments in those colonies. So in Connecticut, we have sort of more of a stable situation of governance than we do in the other colonies. There isn't this overthrow because Trumbull is cool. But in Massachusetts, we have provisional revolutionary governments that are leading at the local level and also at the state or colony level. So these prisoners will basically be left to the responsibility of those bodies. And most of the time, the decision will be made, particularly in the early years of the war, is hire them out. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Make them work for their subsistence. Put them in communities where they can do some good in this sort of war-burdened economies that we're seeing. Right.
Okay.
So you can. In New York, there's even the recommendation by the Albany Committee of Safety that says, these are soldiers, make them train your guys, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, okay, make them train you in the military exercise, I think is specifically the instruction that is given, right? Whether that happened or not, I'm not sure, but that was the directive that was given. You mentioned families as well, which gives me opportunity to talk about captive British Allied soldiers' wives. And a lot of the times women, could choose essentially if they wanted to accompany their husbands or fathers into captivity, if they wanted to or not. Because as historian Holly Mayer has talked about, wherever you're going to see bodies of troops in the American Revolution, you'll see women and children following, these sort of camp followers, right? So what happens, right, when your group gets captured? What I've found is that most of the time there is a choice because these are more mouths to feed, right? You're not necessarily going to be taken against your will, right? But you might not have another choice because how else are you going to provide for yourself or are you just going to go off and be on your own now? So women and children would be able to choose to follow the husbands, fathers into captivity. And then they, just like the prisoners themselves, would have various opportunities to work for their subsistence, particularly when those sort of provisions and things are not coming through, which becomes all the more tenuous as the war continues. A lot of the prisoners from Ticonderoga and Crown Point will end up at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which emerges as a hub, actually, for prisoner administration during the war. And this is where we'll see, again, a lot of that hiring out, where prisoners can go and work and they can labor and they can earn money for themselves and their families.
At the fort itself, what was captured? Besides the people, the arms, ammunition. Describe the treasure trove of things that they captured.
So there's a good deal of artillery that's captured at Ticonderoga. We see actually so much so that Henry Knox is going to return to Ticonderoga in a few months and is going to start taking pieces to bring back to Boston and fortify Dorchester Heights to force ultimately the evacuation of the British from that city in March of 76. Was
that the Noble Train of Artillery?
The Noble Train of, yes, right? Henry Knox's moving company is just about as good as it comes.
Yeah. But this is where they came from.
Yes, they came from Fort Ticonderoga. I think they may have also gotten some artillery from Crown Point as well, but the most of it is coming from Ticonderoga. So Henry Knox chooses about 60 pieces of artillery total. Most of these are going to be 12 and 18 pounders, but there is a really big one that's a 24 pounder, and they call it the Old Sow because it's really heavy. But total, he's going to take about 60 tons of artillery.
60 tons or 60 pieces?
60 pieces. You're right.
Pieces.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. That's a formidable amount of artillery.
It is, and he's got a distance to travel with it too, and so he's going to bring these again. And he's not just taking artillery. He's also taking critical supplies like boat building supplies, right? There's flour at Ticonderoga, so this is going to be really important for actually feeding what will become the Continental Army. Shells for those howitzers that he takes and mortars that are also captured at Ticonderoga. Musket balls are taken at Ticonderoga. Gunpowder, various small arms, things like this. So it's really just a trove of military materials for the early Continental Army that becomes very important to them. And that's why, we talk about Knox as having achieved this terrific victory and why Ticonderoga is strategically important, not just because of where it's positioned on Lake Champlain, but also because it provides all these materials to the nation American cause. And this is something that people are aware of. This is written about. This is celebrated. This is heralded as it ought to have been. And it's a huge morale boost, right?
And was this all in the plan at the beginning, or did they just want the fort, but then didn't realize, that they were going to end up with all of these weapons?
No, I think this is part of the goal from the beginning, right? This is, we want to be able to go capture these supplies. And remember, these are Americans who are attacking Ticonderoga with the mindset that Guy Carleton is going to use this fort as a launching point to attack the Americans, right? And so this is kind of a vindication to find, even though, again, it's a caretaker garrison, there's only about 50 soldiers there. This is almost a vindication. It's like, oh, well, they very well could have used this against us. They could have mounted this attack. Guy Carleton could have used these materials. And so, yes, I think that this is part of the intention as well, is to get the materials that they need to be able to mount a rebellion against Great Britain.
Right. So now, before we really talk more about Knox and what happened there, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold really need to consolidate their victory at Fort Ticonderoga. So there were a couple other attacks that happened within days. So can you talk about what happened there?
Absolutely. So I mentioned that they go from Castleton, Vermont, they go over to Hans Cove, which is the crossing point. And that is where Allen is going to split off his force because, again, they've achieved, once they've got the boats, they know they're going to be able to pull off this early morning attack, right? And there is kind of a sticking point where there's a bit of confusion and delays about, are we going to be able to get boats from Skanesboro, Crown Point? They're able to get 2 flat bottom boats, as I mentioned earlier. Once it's clear that this is going to be successful, this is when Allen feels confident enough to be able to split his force. So he's going to send a detachment to Fort Crown Point, which I've talked about. It's about 15 miles away, also on Fort Champlain, and that is actually going to be led by his cousin, Seth Warner. And so Seth Warner is going to attack Crown Point within a few days of the attack on Ticonderoga. And similarly to Ticonderoga, this is a caretaker garrison. It had recently burned. I think it was the early 1770s that it burned. So it's not really like the jewel of the British Empire on Champlain or anything like that. It has even fewer troops garrisoning it than Ticonderoga did. There's only about 9 there, actually.
Oh, wow.
But Warner will take them prisoners too. And so this is adding to the total number of people that they're actually taking prisoners. This is one of the sort of simultaneous engagements or engagements to think about happening close to the same time as Ticonderoga. And then another detachment is going to go to Skanesboro, which is even further down on Lake Champlain, again, about another 15 miles in the opposite direction of Ticonderoga. And Scainsborough, this detachment is specifically instructed to go and try to capture royal governor of that city, if you will, or of that community. What they end up doing is they capture the son, Andrew Skene, and he's a loyalist. He's basically sort of emblematic of that abuse against the New Hampshire grants that I talked about at the very beginning, or what Allen would have called the abuse against the New Hampshire grants. So he is appointed by Whitehall to be the royal governor of Scainsborough and to go and sort of represent the New York ownership of this contested land. And so he's going to be there. He's also appointed sort of he's given command over Ticonderoga and Crown Point with that appointment. And so he's definitely a strategically important military target for them to be able to secure. They secure his son, and they're also, while they're at Scainsborough, able to secure more watercraft, which is really important because we're talking about lakes. We're talking about Lake George and Lake Champlain. And if you've got watercraft on those lakes, you've got control of this really important region. And so this is something that the colonies don't have in 1775. And by going to Scainsborough, capturing Andrew Skene, they're also going to come away with boats that can be used in yet another simultaneous engagement, which is Arnold basically attacking a British vessel at Fort St. John.
Okay.
So Fort St. John is just another fort. This one's actually at the southernmost tip of Quebec, and they're going to go further up. Yeah, so further up towards Canada on Lake Champlain. Arnold's going to use one of those commandeered vessels from the Scainsborough expedition, is going to take that up, and he's going to attack an armed British vessel just outside of Fort St. John, and he's going to take another 12 prisoners in that engagement.
Was that all in May?
Yeah, so that I think that one's May. I want to say May 19th. That's my birthday. So of course, me being a shameless fan of Benedict Arnold, he would have. It might be May 18th, but yes, these all. So Crown Point, Ticonderoga, St. John, Scainsborough raid, attack, whatever you want to call it. All those things sort of happen within a few days of one another.
Yeah, because I mean, later on in the summer and then into early winter, we have the Battle of Quebec. So it's interesting that he went up pretty close to Quebec as part of this campaign.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that actually because he goes and he's got sort of modest goals. I think Arnold is one thing you can say about Arnold when you're comparing their leadership strategies is maybe he's a little bit more realistic than Allen because they capture this vessel. And then they're coming back. So now they've got the captured vessel from Scainsborough and they've got this British ship that they're bringing back as well. And he actually passes Allen on the way, right? So they'd taken Ticonderoga and then there's contested reports, but Arnold basically writes to the Continental Congress and he says, Allen has no control over his men. They're plundering everything here. They're completely out of control. And within a few days of Ticonderoga being taken, Arnold's guys that he'd been recruiting in Massachusetts, the ones who couldn't run as fast as he could to go intercept the expedition, they catch up. They're like, hey, boss, here we are. What do you want to do? And he's like, let's go to Fort St. John and take this British ship. And so as he's got modest aims for this, he's like, I want to get the ship. I want to get the people on the ship. And then I want to come back to Ticonderoga, basically report back to headquarters, if you will. And as he's coming back, he actually crosses Allen, whose men are apparently done plundering at Ticonderoga. Now they're going to go attack Fort St. John. And Arnold says, don't do this. You know, I mean, Allen, I think we all know, he's somebody who's very ambitious and he really thinks that if you've just got enough might and maybe enough firepower, you can do anything. And he's on a roll. And no, he wants to go and attack Fort St. John, even though he's not quite prepared to do that. So it's funny that you mentioned that, these things are happening very close to one another. Again, Arnold tries to dissuade Allen from making an attack on St. John. It's much closer to Montreal. It's much closer to the core of British authority in Canada, and they can very easily come and stop you from successfully taking this fort. Allen, please turn back. Please turn back. Of course, he doesn't, and eventually Allen will be captured by the British for his gravitas and for attacking in places maybe he shouldn't. Yeah,
and I think this is early signs too that Benedict Arnold, who we would all come to hate.
All of us? Not me.
well, later on. But at this point, I mean, he's showing some really great instincts. I mean, a strategic thinker, but also brilliant when it comes to tactics as well, to fighting. So yeah, he's going to play a significant role in a good way for the American Revolution.
No, completely agree.
Yeah.
And you talked about, yes, he's going to start playing a much bigger role. And we tend to think about Arnold's contributions during this time period as related to the watercraft that we keep coming back to. I mean, watercraft are key to control in this region.
Sure.
And yes, Arnold's going to build a lot of boats as we get into 1776 and beyond. But he's also here, what the most important thing he's doing, he's taking them, right?
Yeah.
And he's able to strategically identify where are these ships, how do we commandeer them effectively and efficiently, and then bring them back to be used by the Americans.
So now we've got Ticonderoga, Crown Point, St. John. How long do we hold these forts, and what is the overall strategic value of maintaining those?
Yeah, so I think we all sort of know how the Canadian expedition eventually ends up going, and the Americans, I think I would argue, start with really opportunistic ideas about getting the Canadians on board, right? But taking Crown Point and Ticonderoga almost act contrary to those goals in a sense, because at this point, part of the reason why Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire militiamen even decide to undergo the expedition against Ticonderoga is because they have been sending, diplomats, again, for lack of a better word, but emissaries, messengers to Canada and say, is anybody up there sympathetic to what we're doing, to this little project? And it turns out there is a sizable amount of support, right, for the American cause, but it's not going to be enough to turn Canada into the 14th colony, right? It's not going to be enough for Canada to send delegates to the Second Continental Congress. And so strategically, what does Ticonderoga offer us? I think it's really threefold. It's those supplies that we talked about before that are going to be so critical to forcing the British to evacuate from Boston. It is the morale boost that it gives to the Americans, showing that there can be a successful operation against a British garrison they successfully take, right? And I think it's also this element of controlling Champlain and being able to assert dominance in this historically significant region when it comes to early American conflicts, right? As we started with the 7 Years' War, and it was this important area during that time. Now the Americans can say they are in possession of the Rock of Gibraltar, which is huge, again, for that morale element in 1775.
Yeah. The cannons, how, with the Knox expedition, what's the soonest they're able to get the cannons actually to Boston?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it was, I think the expedition goes over the winter, right? And so they don't get them there until about 10 months later, I think. So.
That sounds right. Yeah. And I mean, he's having to move these over frozen lakes and also overland as well. So there's difficulties with that. There are delays related to when these things actually break through the ice and fall into the water, having to actually take the time to stop, to pause, to pull them back out. So really fascinating time period as well, just fraught with delays, but ultimately does end up forcing that removal of the British from Boston, which is another huge boon to the early American cause.
And then you talked about what happened to Ethan Allen, but so after these victories, what happens with Benedict Arnold?
Oh, well,
you always seem to light up when I bring up his name.
I know. Well, I'm a big fan of him. I think probably his next most notable, and we could talk about Valcour Island and other sort of things that he's doing in this region particularly, but I think what we best know him for, or what I would say we should know him best for, is his heroics at Saratoga. And he's there fighting with Horatio Gates, and I would argue shows a lot more might and willingness to engage than Horatio Gates does. And I tend to be sympathetic to the perspective that had Arnold not been there to rally his men when Gates was more content to sort of sit and wait, we might not call Saratoga the victories that it ended up being at Bemis Heights and at Freeman's Farm, for sure.
Yeah, I think Arnold demonstrates that audacity in battle. We have the principles of war. There's 8 principles of war.
Mouse.
Yeah. But I always add an additional one called audacity.
I like it
because I think that that separates a lot of leaders. Okay leaders to great leaders.
I totally
and
agree.
I think Arnold encompasses that. You think of people like Patton, Grant, people like this. That that have that audacity to. Anyway,
I like
just throw that out there. Yeah,
I know,
Yeah.
and I like audacity a lot. And actually, another word that Arnold might have used would be enterprise, because that's what he renames the ship that he captures at St. John as
Oh, yeah,
Enterprise.
yeah.
So I think audacity, enterprise, definitely Arnold's got a lot of both.
And I think that there's a famous quote from Napoleon. I'm trying not to get too off the track here, but he said audacity, 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 always audacity. And I think when you use the principles of war and you include that, I think that tips the scale in a lot of battles throughout history. But,
Yeah, I think looking at Ticonderoga, you can check off probably all 8 of those principles were
Right.
used in different ways. Surprise probably chief among.
Sure.
But certainly, and this is another piece of Arnold's leadership, is that he tends to think that whereas Allen is more of a frontier militiaman, he's someone who really understands better than Allen does what the regularities of war are according to the British tradition, and he's somebody who is very sympathetic to what Washington wants, which is to create more of a regular force. So I think he has that balancing effort as well that really counteracts Allen quite nicely when we're talking about this series of engagements.
Is there anything we missed? Anything you want to bring up that we didn't address?
Yeah, well, I think we mentioned it earlier, but I wanted to return to it briefly. Is there is this quote that is attributed to Allen about, in the name of the great Jehovah and the Second Continental Congress, I take you, William Delaplace, prisoner. And I think it's very interesting because Ticonderoga is taken on May 10th, 1775, and that day is significant for another reason, which is that it's the first day that the Second Continental Congress starts meeting in Philadelphia.
Oh.
So under the authority of who, Allen? Again, one more time for us.
Yeah.
Louder for the people in the back, right? Second Continental Congress is still asleep in Philadelphia right now, my guy. Let's think about this. So I think it's important, and this, is something that I've thought about a lot, is why is there this need to sort of justify him taking William Delaplace captive and justify it by the Second Continental Congress? And I think it really reflects the attempt of revolutionaries in this early period to assert a legality to their behavior, right, that really doesn't exist yet and that won't begin to coalesce for several more years, where the Continental Congress is constantly having to sort of justify its own existence. And I think it's interesting that he says this. Again, whether or not he actually said it is a question for another time, but the fact that he says he said it, I think, is telling. And it underscores this question of authority, which continues to persist throughout, the entire history of American prisoner administration during the Revolutionary War, because constantly in 1775, these prisoners taken from Lexington, taken from Concord, taken from these Canadian and New York engagements that we've been talking about, they're asking the question, under whose authority have we been imprisoned? And the revolutionaries don't really have a great answer to that in 1775, right? Because we're still... Declaration of Independence isn't signed until July of 1776,
right?
And so
Over
we're
a year
still
later,
right? And so we're still in this.
George
early,
Washington's not in command yet.
George Washington's not in command.
In fact, there's no Continental Army.
There's
at this
no Continental
point.
Army. Yeah, so we're still very much sort of dealing with an amorphous sort of American cause that has yet to coalesce, but there is that drive to add some legitimacy to their behavior. So I think that even as we as historians kind of like to interrogate that Allen quote and say, maybe he said this, maybe he said that, I think the first one is really telling of this historical moment that we find ourselves in with Ticonderoga.
Well, and, even if it wasn't the Second Continental Congress, maybe he would have said the Continental Congress at the moment, because we already had the First Continental Congress that met.
Right, but wasn't actively meeting at the time.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, good. And, before we close, it's time for a huzzah trivia. So do you have some piece of Army trivia that you can share with us?
So it's language trivia, not Army trivia, but hopefully the Army is welcoming of that as well. I always thought the name Ticonderoga was very interesting. To me, it sort of flows off the tongue, but I know other people struggle with the pronunciation. And it's a word from the Iroquois tradition that means the meeting of the waters, which helps. Yeah, it kind of helps me think about where it is whenever I'm trying to.
The meeting of the waters.
The meeting of the waters.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So it's interesting, right? Because it's the confluence of Lake George and Lake Champlain, and when you're trying to sort of orient yourself in the early American world, words like that are descriptive and useful. So Ticonderoga, meeting of the waters.
An Iroquois word.
Yes.
Great. I love it. Oh, go. Thank you so much, Brynne. I appreciate
Thank you.
Your time and all of your insights today about the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in the early months of the American Revolution. So if anyone wants to learn more about the American Revolution or the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, then I encourage you to visit our website at history.army.mil. And we've got a whole new pamphlet series that's out about the American Revolution, the Army in the Revolution. And the topics we're talking about today are in our very first pamphlet called Opening Shots. And it covers the Continental Army in the colonies from 1775 to 1776. And those are available from our website as free PDF downloads. So anybody can check those out. Easy to read. These are great pamphlets. I mean, it's good information. They're short. They're about 60 to 80 pages, and a lot of great, valuable information.
Totally agree.
And if folks, if you want to learn more or experience Army history every day, then you can visit us on social media, on Facebook, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.